If you grew up in the 1970s, there are things you did as a kid that would absolutely get your parents pulled over, fined, or arrested today. And here's the strange part. Back then, nobody thought twice about it. No one called it dangerous. No one called it irresponsible. No one called the police. We weren't fearless. We weren't tougher. We were just living inside a system that hadn't figured out yet how close to the edge we really were. This isn't a story about how the past was better. It's a story about how normal danger used to feel and how lucky a lot of us actually were. Kids riding in truck beds. There was a time when the back of a pickup truck wasn't a red flag. It was the best seat in the house. No seat belts, no helmets, no padding, just bare metal, maybe a toolbox, maybe a spare tire, and a bunch of kids sitting with their legs dangling, gripping the side rail like it was part of the adventure. You felt every bump in the road, every sharp turn, every sudden acceleration, and somehow that made it better. The wind slapped your face, gravel rattled underneath, and you waved at cars behind you like you were on a parade float instead of one bad turn away from disaster. Parents didn't panic. Drivers didn't get pulled over. Police didn't chase you down. It was just how things were done. Today, in many places, that same scene would trigger sirens, fines, maybe even a court date. Not because people suddenly got softer, but because enough kids didn't hold on tight enough, and enough luck eventually ran out. Cars with no seatbelts. If you ever rode in a big American car in the 1970s, you remember the seats. Long, shiny vinyl benches that felt like they'd been polished with lemon spray. No shoulder belts, sometimes no belts at all. When the driver turned right, everyone slid left. When the driver turned left, everyone slid right, laughing, bracing themselves with elbows and knees, treating basic physics like a party trick. You learned balance before you learned safety. Nobody strapped you in. Nobody checked twice. It wasn't neglect, it was normal. Today, letting a child ride like that would be considered reckless. Back then, it was just another way to pass time on a long drive, press shoulder to shoulder, sliding together like loose change on a dashboard. Smoking on airplanes. There was a moment in history when stepping onto an airplane meant stepping into a flying ashtray. Smoke curled through the cabin. Ashtrays were built into armrests, and nobody thought it was strange to light up at 30,000 feet with strangers, children, and infants sitting inches away. You didn't ask if someone minded. You didn't apologize. It was simply allowed. Flight attendants handed out drinks, sometimes cigarettes, and the haze was so thick it became part of the atmosphere, like turbulence or engine noise. Looking back, it sounds absurd. Today, the idea of someone striking a match on a plane would cause instant panic. But in the 1970s, it was just another reminder that comfort always came before caution, and no one imagined the air itself could be a shared risk. Lawn darts for kids. If you didn't grow up throwing heavy metal darts across a backyard, you might not believe this was ever sold as a family game. They weren't plastic. They weren't soft. They weren't rounded. They were solid, weighted darts with sharp metal tips, designed to arc through the air and land point first into the ground. The box showed smiling families, kids lined up, parents watching proudly, as if this were no more dangerous than tossing a frisbee. And we played it exactly like that. You'd launch the dart high, watch it spin in the sunlight, and hope it landed where it was supposed to. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Back then, nobody talked about risk assessments or product liability. If someone got hurt, it was chalked up to bad luck or poor aim. Today, it's almost impossible to explain how casually something that dangerous was handed to children and called entertainment. Not because people didn't care, but because danger hadn't yet been translated into statistics, lawsuits, and warnings printed in bold letters. Getting paddled at school. In the 1970s, discipline didn't come with a meeting or a counseling session. It came with a paddle. A real one, flat, wooden, sometimes with holes drilled into it, hanging behind the teacher's desk like a reminder of who was in charge. If you crossed the line, you were told to stand up, walk forward, and take it. No debate, no explanation. Parents didn't protest. Many cases, they supported it. It was seen as order, not abuse. Correction, not cruelty. Students learned quickly where the limits were, not because they were reasoned with, but because pain made the lesson unforgettable. Today, for most Americans, the idea of striking a student in school feels unthinkable, even though in a few states it technically still exists. But at the time, it was woven into the fabric of authority. The classroom wasn't just a place of learning, it was a place where obedience was enforced physically, and nobody expected it to be any other way. No phones, no tracking. There was a kind of silence in the 1970s that no longer exists. When you left the house, you disappeared. No phone, no tracking, no check-ins. If you didn't come home until dark, nobody assumed the worst. They assumed you were busy. Parents didn't hover. Friends didn't panic. Being unreachable wasn't alarming, it was normal. You could wander for hours, ride bikes across neighborhoods, sit somewhere alone with your thoughts, and the world didn't demand to know where you were every second. That solitude wasn't loneliness, it was space. Today, constant contact is expected. Silence feels suspicious. Back then, silence was freedom. And while it didn't make life safer, it made it feel larger, slower, and strangely more human. In the 1970s, toy guns didn't look like toys. They looked real, heavy, dark, detailed down to the grip and barrel, sometimes even made of metal. Kids ran through neighborhoods holding them, pointing them, pretending to be soldiers or cops, and nobody screamed. Parents didn't panic. Neighbors didn't call the police. Everyone understood it was play. There was an unspoken agreement that imagination didn't equal danger. Today, that same object would stop traffic, shut down a school, and possibly end a life before anyone had time to explain. The toy didn't change. The world around it did. Reality caught up to appearances, and suddenly, what once felt harmless became unacceptable. Not because children changed, but because consequences became impossible to ignore. Drinking and driving was normal. There was a time when having a few drinks and then driving home wasn't seen as reckless. It was routine. People talked about one for the road, like it was part of the evening, not a gamble. Bars emptied into parking lots, keys jingled, engines started, and nobody staged an intervention. The laws were looser. The warnings were quieter. Accidents happened, but they were framed as tragedy, not prevention failures. Only later did patterns emerge, numbers pile up, and stories connect. We understand today how dangerous driving after drinking truly was. But back then, the danger wasn't invisible, it just wasn't named yet. Responsibility came later, after enough lives proved that casual habits can still be lethal. Cigarettes from vending machines. There were machines that sold adulthood for pocket change. You dropped in coins and out came cigarettes. Sometimes beer. No questions, no ID. Kids could stand there, eye level with the buttons, buying things that today require warnings, age checks, and locked cabinets. It wasn't rebellion, it was convenience. Those machines stood in gas stations, diners, even some workplaces, humming quietly like they belonged there. And for a while they did. Only later did people stop and ask who those machines were really serving, and who they were quietly training. When they disappeared, it wasn't because the past was wrong, but because the future demanded better boundaries. Babysitters with no rules. Babysitting in the 1970s didn't come with training manuals or background checks. It came with a house key, a fridge full of soda and beer, and a quick wave from parents already halfway out the door. Teenagers were left in charge of children with no phone to call for help, no list of emergency numbers taped to the wall, and no expectation that anything could possibly go wrong. After the kids went to sleep, the house often turned into something else entirely. A cigarette by the window, a drink from the fridge, sometimes friends stopping by Because why not? It wasn't neglect. It was trust, stretched thin and held together by habit. Parents assumed maturity would rise to the occasion. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Today, the idea of a 15-year-old drinking, smoking, and hosting friends while responsible for a child would cause outrage. Back then, it barely raised an eyebrow. Not because people didn't care, but because responsibility was learned by being handed too much of it too soon. We didn't grow up in a safer world. We grew up in a quieter one, where danger didn't announce itself with warning labels and alert tones. A world that trusted people to figure things out as they went, and sometimes paid the price when they didn't. Looking back, it's easy to laugh, easy to shake your head and say, you can't believe any of this was normal. But it was. Not because the past was smarter, or tougher, or better. It was simply unfinished. The rules we live with now were written by the mistakes we survived then. And every memory you just smiled at is proof that luck played a bigger role than we like to admit. If you lived through it, you weren't fearless. You were fortunate.